Ready?
Yeah.
Everybody, welcome to how Salesforce uses Agentforce to document APIs. Before we dive into the content, I just want to give the typical forward-looking statement. Base any purchasing decisions based on what information is publicly available, not on any forward-looking information that I'm going to share with you today. My name is Todd Bernsdorf. I am a Director of Product Management here at Salesforce. I've been here for about 7.5 years. Been working on MuleSoft since the first day I got here. And within the data and integration space, I've pretty much spent my whole career over the past 25 years in this space.
Hi everyone, my name is Sudhanshu Joshi. I'm a lead member of technical staff in the data and integration space. I've been at Salesforce for just about 8 years.
Thanks, Sid. All right, quick question. How many people like documenting APIs or doing technical documentation in general? Come on. All right, I got one unicorn over here, but pretty much I was expecting absolutely no hands to go up, right? How about this question? How many people would say having good documentation is critical to running a really efficient organization, right? We all agree that that's also incredibly important. We did our own little research before we dove into this just to kind of back up what our assumptions were. I know we were just talking earlier, like as a product owner many years ago, I remember those documentation stories that would be on my Scrum wall. They were usually the ones that floated to the bottom, got pushed from sprint to sprint to sprint, and eventually they just kind of got moved to the backlog, and we'll get to those later, right? And what we found is 58% of developers were saying API documentation is important, but inconsistent documentation is an enormous roadblock to getting things done. So what happens when you don't have good documentation? You have to reverse engineer what's already there. You start digging through source code, you make some best guesses about what the previous engineer did, you hope you get it right, you get halfway there, then you have to try and track down the people that were part of the previous project that knows kind of the business logic that went into it. It's not very efficient at all. So in those situations, you end up being reliant on colleagues. At Salesforce, we're a global company, and it may be that I'm inheriting something from somebody that was in Sydney, Australia, or in London, England, and it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and well, it's in the middle of the night for them. So I've just lost another day of work because I can't get the information that I need. So besides not having the information you need, when I took a look at the Cloud Hub platform that we have at Salesforce, just to try and get a sense of where I'm at, I had about 900 apps that I consider reusable assets that I want to expose for other business capabilities or for Agentforce development, and they were lacking documentation, right? So an estimated 1 to 2 pages of documents per app, about 400 words, 5 hours per person. That's a lot of work to update all of this stuff. And in addition, I'm deploying about 200 new apps every year. So how do I use Agentforce to enable teams to spend time on building innovative solutions rather than doing all of this manual documentation that we all agree nobody likes to do? So when we approached Agentforce, we knew we wanted it to document the APIs, yes, but there's also 3 things that, as a product person, that I was going to measure this as a success, right? Obviously, I want to reduce all of that manual labor and all manual time that goes into creating these documentation, but I don't want this to be a one and done exercise where I documented an API and I just kind of wash my hands, because we know apps have a life cycle, there's going to be many changes. How do I know like the latest changes have now been incorporated into this documentation? And last but not least, one that's I think is the most important, is I want to increase productivity of our engineers. And now that I'm going to have a whole suite of well-documented apps, how do you discover those easily using Agentforce, right? So what I was saying is well-documented APIs and discoverable APIs at the end of the day is going to enable us to create better agents. So Sud, how did we approach this from an architecture and an engineering perspective?
So yeah, so to solve this problem, we built an Agentforce service agent, which we deployed on our Anypoint Experience Hub. Anypoint Experience Hub is our internal documentation, our internal API portal, where we expose our reusable APIs to our internal developers and internal engineering teams. And they are able to go through those APIs and see which APIs they can reuse. So this Agentforce service agent connects with Cloud Hub platform, where our APIs are deployed and developed. And we also have Data Cloud, where we have ingested all of our unstructured data, like our technical design documents, our requirement documents that lives in Confluence, in Google Drive. All that information has been ingested into Data Cloud as unstructured data. So when we go to the Agentforce service agent and ask it to create documentation for us, it uses the Data Cloud vector search to find all the information it can about the API, and it also pulls in the metadata from Exchange, like the API specification that you have created in Design Center. It uses that information, combine those two, and then generates the documentation. Once the documentation is generated, it returns that documentation back to the user so that we can keep the human in loop, and we verify that documentation that has been generated is accurate. Or if you want any changes, you can interact with the agent, ask it to change the description of a particular endpoint, or if you wanted to add some more details on an endpoint, you can ask that. And then later on, you can ask it to publish that documentation. That documentation then goes back into Exchange. From Exchange, it gets synced back into our API portal, and then any developer who's trying to build any solution can reuse that API. At the same time, we are also syncing the reusable APIs using API Catalog, which is a latest offering from MuleSoft that came out in the spring release, so that you can use these APIs that are now very well documented as actions for your new agents. So to build this agent, we followed MuleSoft's reliable API-led connectivity approach. We have our Agentforce agent, which is calling the enterprise actions. These enterprise actions include Salesforce flows for calling APIs, and we have Data Cloud connectivity through Companion.org to get all the vector search results. Then below that, we have our 3-layer architecture with Experience API, Process API, our System API. And these System APIs are our Exchange APIs, the Cloud Hub APIs that you can use that comes as part of the platform to read that metadata information that I talked about earlier. And then we also have a System API on top of our Einstein LLM gateway, which we use to give all this information, all the metadata, all the vector search results as context to the LLM so that it can generate that documentation that we want to publish in Exchange. Now let's see how it works.
Live demos, gotta love that.
So here is our API portal. We have our DocChain agent running here. Now, let's say this is the API that I want to create the documentation for. Right now, you can see that the documentation is completely empty. I'm going to copy the name of this API, and I'm going to ask DocChain, I want to document an API. Now, because this is an Agentforce service agent, the conversation happens in natural language. You can ask the same question in 10 different ways, and the agent would be able to figure out your intent, will be able to map that intent to an action, and then it's able to figure out what information it needs to collect from the user to build that documentation. So here it's asking me to give it the name of a business group where the API is deployed, the name of the API, and the asset version. So let's give it the name.
In BT integration, that's the team that you're a member of, correct?
Yes. So I don't have to tell the agent that this is the name of the business group. It's smart enough to recognize the pattern, and it's able to figure out that the information that I just provided is the name of the business group. Now I'll give it the name of the API. All right, so let's say we want it to be done for the latest. Let's just say yes. So now it's going to take that information about the API name and try to pull all the metadata it can from Exchange. And at the same time, it will go to Data Cloud and try to pull all the information it can about this API that we have in our internal documentation. Once it uses that information, it will send that information to the LLM gateway, and then it will return us a transaction ID. So right now, because the documentation generation takes about 1.5 minutes, and Agentforce has a 30-second timeout, we do this process asynchronously. So using this transaction ID, I can ask it to check the status so that once the documentation generation is completed, it will return that response back to me. But because everything is happening in the same context, I don't even have to give it the transaction ID. All I need to do is ask it, is it done?
Does asking if it's done, does it impact the performance of generating the documentation?
Yep. So here is the documentation that was generated. It provides a short description, a summary, and then it gives you a list of all the endpoints and like what each endpoint does. Now, I go in, I validate, everything looks good. I'm ready to publish this documentation. So the agent can publish that for me. I'll ask it to go ahead and publish this in Exchange. All right, the documentation has been published. Now, if I go back to Exchange, it takes it about 30 seconds for this to get published in Exchange. So I'm going to refresh my screen. All right, so you can see there is a draft available.
So that means it's being updated as we're looking at this right now, right?
Yeah.
Real time. So once the view draft is gone, it means it's been published, right? Boom.
And here we have it. The same documentation that we saw in the agent is now published in Exchange. And you can even go to the other pages that it created, like how to consume this API. It will give you the information about like who you can reach out to if you need to get any approval to request access to this API. All this information is coming from our documentation that we have in our different places. All right, Todd, back to you.
So this use case hopefully gives you some idea of what's possible. It did address one of the key things, which is all of the time that goes into documenting an API. So with a single agent, I saved approximately 5 hours of documentation time on this app, times the 900 I was talking before. We're looking at almost 4,500 hours of labor saved. The one thing I will say as a caveat, and we'll get to the final where we're planning to take all of this stuff, we're using a prompt today based out of the API Experience Hub, which is another MuleSoft offering. The intent is at some point in time to get this in our pipeline, so anytime an app is being built and deployed, that documentation is built, it's also going to version it and give us the latest versioning, so I don't have to go in and do this every time. It's going to be dynamic behind the scenes, and I know everything is going to be well documented.
Yeah,
right?
and that would be super powerful because at that time, the agent would be able to also understand the code and add even more information in the documentation because it's integrated into your deployment pipeline. So right now it's using the API spec and the technical design documents, but then it will also be able to read code and understand what the code is exactly doing and then add that information into the documentation.
That will be so awesome. So, forward, we've got thousands of APIs now, and I want to build an agent off of all of this 1,000 or so APIs to choose from. How do I find the one that's going to work for me?
Yeah, so another action that we have added to this agent is an API recommendation. Since we are already ingesting all this metadata about our APIs into Data Cloud, we can easily use that same metadata to search for API recommendation. So let me show you how that works. In the same agent, I can ask if I have a use case where I want to know if there is an API available for a particular reuse, I can simply ask it, is there an API available for Nova technology? So it's going to go back into Data Cloud and then try to search information about Nova technology and see what comes up. And once it finds that result, it will return that back to us along with the name of the business group where that API is deployed. And it will also give us a short description like what this API is supposed to do. And the Exchange URL and the API Orbit URL where you can go in and read more about the API, request access to this API. And this is how we are promoting reuse internally within Salesforce. The biggest problem that we have seen is people don't find APIs that they need to build their solution, and they go ahead and build their own API. These APIs end up being single-use APIs, and you end up having a bunch of single-use API instead of promoting reusability. So having an agent like this that can write documentation for you and then give recommendations for you of what API you can use will be really powerful for that reuse.
Thanks, Sid. Yeah, having thousands of APIs is a good thing, but it can also be what you're saying, API sprawl if you're not smart about how you're documenting these and reusing these. So what we showed you today is just what we're doing today for APIs that are built using the MuleSoft platform and deployed to our Anypoint Exchange. The thing I want to make note of is this API catalog, right? So for us, if anybody's ever built applications on the Salesforce core platform and needed to invoke some kind of an action or an API out of Cloud Hub, you know it's not easy, right? I think the Mule product team said they estimate it's around 20 clicks plus various governance bodies you need to go through to make that happen, right? So with the introduction of the API catalog, now that we have all of these well-documented APIs, we can now go into the Anypoint Exchange, tag those apps, tell Cloud Hub which Salesforce orgs we want to be able to publish these documented APIs into, and we can do that by tagging them, and they'll end up in any of these different Salesforce orgs, and you can now use those as invocable actions, whether it's to build new capabilities or to create new topics and agents to go along with it. So today we're just looking at how we're documenting MuleSoft APIs, but our long-term goal is, my team also has about 40 plus RPAs, robotic process automations, which are also could be reusable assets. We can also do the same thing that we're doing with APIs. We can tag those, put those into the API catalog. It's now something you can invoke from the core platform using Flow or any of those other great tools that we offer. And then the other one is we also have Heroku. People don't always use MuleSoft. They do use tools like Python to build their own apps. They do some of this stuff in AWS as well. But with Flex Gateway, we can now bring those into the Anypoint Exchange and also leverage the document generation tool to document those as well. Again, creating even more possibilities for you to build new capabilities using agents. That being said, I threw a lot of information at you. Hopefully this inspired you to come up with some ideas where you could do something similar at your firm. If you have any questions about how we architected, built this, implemented it, any of the pain points we have or any challenges you have that you think we might be able to help you with, we're located back here at the Salesforce on Salesforce area on level 2. We'll be here tomorrow and we would love to chat with you. So that being said, I just want to thank everybody for taking time out to spend time with Sudhanshu and I. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.